Kip, welcome back to Infusion. You know, almost 4 years ago, I went to bed thinking that Hillary Clinton was going to be our president, and I woke up to Donald Trump as our next president. You know, many of you have seen Kip in person at previous Infusion conferences, and we always look forward to his inside the Beltway perspective. You know, Kip, it seems like every 4 years we always say that this year's election is the most important ever. And really, it doesn't seem any different this year. But before I let you dig into this topic, let me formally introduce you. Kip Eideberg is the Senior Vice President, Government and Industry Relations at the Association of Equipment Manufacturer, better known as AEM. So think about Caterpillar and Deere and Komatsu and Vermeer and Ditch Witch, a bunch of really big companies compared to McElroy. So we really appreciate Kip spending time with us today. As the head of the Washington, D.C. office, he guides strategy for AEM's government relations, public affairs, grassroots advocacy, and policy efforts, working with member companies and allied organizations. Under his leadership, AEM's government and public affairs team advances pro-manufacturing policies on behalf of more than 1,000 member companies. Kip is going to provide us with an inside look at the 2020 election and what to expect from the next administration. Kip, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dave, and thanks for that kind introduction. I too remember the day after that election, and as I recall, I believe I owe you a case of beer for getting the prediction wrong. But I'd like to think that I'm in good company because a lot of us got it wrong. So, as Dave mentioned, my name is Kip Eideberg. I'm the Senior Vice President of Government and Industry Relations at the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. For those not familiar with AEM, it is the international trade association representing off-road equipment manufacturers and suppliers with more than 1,000 member companies and more than 200 product lines in the agriculture and construction-related industry sectors worldwide. And McElroy has been a member of the association for a long time, and we are very proud and grateful for the partnership between our association and McElroy. And it is always a pleasure to be part of Infusion, and I would like to thank Chip, Sharon, and Dave, of course, and the great team at McElroy for inviting me back to this event. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about our upcoming election, including the current state of play, the keys to the presidential election, as well as the battle for control of the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, and a few election scenarios. I'm also going to cover a bit of crystal ball gazing in terms of what a Trump or Biden administration would bring, as well as a roundup of some of the favorite parlor games that people in Washington usually like to engage in this close to an election. As the saying goes, 8 weeks before an election is a lifetime in politics. And if you have any doubts about the truth of this adage, I suggest you speak with Presidents Michael Dukakis and Hillary Clinton. Simply put, there are few, if any, slam dunks in politics. Elections continue to have the capacity to surprise and confound. When the Democratic primary process began with over 25 candidates, who would ever have thought that we would end up with an election between the two oldest candidates ever to run for office? Current polling indicates that if the election were held today, Vice President Biden is near or above the 270 electoral votes he needs to win election. These same polls say the Senate would flip ever so narrowly to Democratic control, and the House Democratic majority would be relatively unchanged. However, September 23rd is certainly not election day, and now is historically when the race officially gets interesting. And if we've learned anything back in 2016, it is that a little bit of skepticism about polling is in order. With that said, let's dive right in. And if I can have next slide, please. We're going to start with the keys to the presidential election. While pundits rarely agree on anything these days, there is broad consensus that control of the White House will come down to four things. Number one, President Trump's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The 2020 election is shaping up to be the rare one that is not almost exclusively about the economy. More Americans say the COVID-19 pandemic is the most important problem facing the country, and they have about any non-economic issue at any point since 2001. The rare exception was terrorism back in October 2001 for obvious reasons. We have only seen a few elections since polling began where the incumbent was eligible to run for re-election and the economy was not clearly the most important issue. But these elections tell a consistent and worrisome message for President Trump, Whoever is most trusted on the non-economic issue is likely to win the election. The second key to the presidential election is shifting demographics. And this one is particularly true for some of the key states that we hear so much about and that are likely to determine the election. The America that votes in 2020 will have a very different demographic than it did back in 2016. 4 years make a tremendous difference in the proportions of various demographic groups in any given state as people relocate and new potential voters age into eligibility for the first time. Take the state of North Carolina, for example. President Obama carried the Tar Heel state in 2008, only to lose it to Senator Romney in 2012. President Trump, of course, won it in 2016. But that does not mean that the state will yet again support the Republican candidate. An average of about 234,000 new potential voters have moved into the state each year since 2010. Think about that, 234,000 new potential voters every year since 2010. That's a lot of new voters, while 188,000 have departed. This makes for a very different demographic makeup in 2020, and similar demographic shifts have been underway in states such as Georgia and Texas. That brings us to the third key to the presidential election, suburban districts. One of the biggest lessons we learned in 2016 is that in today's political environment, whoever carries the suburbs will likely win the presidential election. Hillary Clinton lost the 6 key battleground states by a combined 455,000 votes, but she lost the suburban counties in those states by 560,000 votes. Democrats turned the tide in the suburbs in 2018 as they recaptured the House by flipping suburban districts across the country. Now, according to a recent analysis from the data firm Catalyst, Democrats are currently estimated to sustain their 2018 advantage in the suburbs in 2020. And if they do, it can help deliver the White House to Joe Biden. However, there are clear signs that President Trump is starting to make inroads with suburban voters. And it is too early to give either candidate a clear advantage with this powerful voting bloc. But if you're going to stay up late on November 3rd, watching the returns, I would keep an eye on those suburban districts, particularly in those battleground states. The fourth key to the presidential election is campaigning in a pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has reshaped not only the 2020 election, but also how candidates up and down the ballot campaign. Traditional events still populate the political calendar, but everything about what candidates and voters will be doing has been upended due to COVID-19. Yes, the political conventions took place, but they look nothing like those of the past. 2 presidential debates have already been moved to new locations as a result of COVID-19. Campaign rallies have been scuttled. Far fewer campaign volunteers will be knocking on the doors of voters, though President Trump and the Republicans are doing their best to maintain some face-to-face mobilization efforts, and they have the edge there over Mr. Biden currently. The casting and the counting of ballots are undergoing more changes as the COVID-19 pandemic accelerates a trend toward voting by mail. And it is impossible to say how all of this will impact the election and the final result. But when the books about the 2020 election are written, I bet there will be several chapters devoted to the impact of the pandemic on the campaign. Next slide, please. So what are the polls telling us about the state of the race? Well, a number of the most respected national polls show Joe Biden with a lead over President Trump. Now, the polls on the screen are a few weeks old, but I checked in with a few reputable pollsters this morning, like Ann Seltzer at Grinnell College, and I can tell you that those numbers have not changed much. And that is the most interesting part about the race. This race is remarkably stable with all the stuff that is going on. The conventions are over. We are through the Labor Day weekend, so we are now about 6 weeks from Election Day, and it is exactly what it has been for most of the year. And I cannot recall an election in modern times where it has been so consistent for so many months. Now, at the same time, it is important to recognize that these are national polls, and they can be misleading. And here's why. We do not have a national election in this country. We have 50 elections. Actually, to be accurate, we have 52 because Nebraska and Maine have their electoral college decided by congressional district. So state polls are the ones that really matter. National polls will tell you a little bit about the mood in the country. It will tell you a little bit about which candidate may have the overall support of voters. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to those 50 states. And that's why state polls, for those of you keeping track at home, are much more indicative of where the race is going than national polls. Next slide, please. So turning to the most recent, or at least some of the most recent state polls, the picture is slightly different. Now, Biden does have a slight lead in many of the swing states. And this, by the way, is the average of head-to-head general election polls that you see on the screen. Now, I expect these races to tighten over the next 4 weeks. But the fact that Biden is up in states like Arizona and Florida this late in the campaign means that the Trump campaign really has not a lot of room for error as it tries to not only recapture those key battleground states that put President Trump in the White House, notably Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Ohio to a certain degree, but also to expand the electoral map by winning states like Arizona, Nevada, and Minnesota. Next slide, please. So looking at the keys to the Senate. Now, currently, the Republicans do have an ever so slight majority in the United States Senate. But again, for those of you who have been following the election at home, you know that that majority is razor thin and is likely to get even thinner after the election. Now, to gain a majority, Democrats need to pick up 4 seats. Or 3 seats if Joe Biden ends up being the president, in which case the vice president would cast the deciding vote. And so 50 seats in the Senate would give Democrats effectively control of the Senate. Now, 35 seats are up for re-election, 12 currently Democratic, 23 currently Republican, if you look at the slide here. There are 6 toss-up Republican seats currently: Colorado, Georgia, Iowa, Maine, Montana, and North Carolina. Now, the Democrats are expected to lose at least 1 seat, and that is Senator Doug Jones in Alabama. That race or that seat is currently listed as a lean Republican. And unfortunately for Doug Jones, I don't think any amount of effort, money, or luck is going to allow him to retain that seat. Now, there's been some talk about Senator Gary Peters from Michigan potentially having a tough race. And while certainly he's probably the only other incumbent Democratic senator who has a bit of a fight on his hands, most polls and most pollsters agree that he's likely to keep that seat. So what does that mean then in terms of where the action is this election in the Senate or in the battle for control of the Senate? Well, it comes down to a number of states, notably Maine, where Susan Collins has a very tough race, North Carolina, where Senator Thom Tillis has a very tough race, Colorado, Senator Cory Gardner has a tough race, Arizona, Senator Sally has a very tough race, and to a certain degree, Iowa, where Senator Ernst, who has been making a lot of progress lately, at least a few months ago, had a fairly significant challenger on facing her. Now, looking at those states, most, again, pollsters would agree that Senator Collins in Maine is likely to lose, Senator Gardner in Colorado likely to lose, Senator McSally in Arizona likely to lose. So that would be then 3 pickups for the Democrats. Now, of course, then you subtract the loss of Senator Jones, and we're looking at 2+ net seats. So where would those other 2 seats then come from if the Democrats hope to take the Senate? Thom Tillis in North Carolina is probably one, or if not the most likely other pickup. I think Senator Ernst is probably gonna hold on to her seat. But the point here is that there's very little room for error on either side, and the control of the U.S. Senate is probably going to be in some ways the most consequential part of our election, in that it could mean the one chamber that the Republicans will still control post-election, and so their way of putting a check on a potential Biden presidency, and also because I think the races there are just going to be so thin. Next slide, please. So, keys to the U.S. House of Representatives. Well, the picture here is a little different in that the Democrats have a fairly sizable majority. The Republicans need to pick up 18 seats to reclaim control. Now, there currently are 28 toss-up seats, 16 incumbent Democrats, 12 incumbent Republicans, about 89 competitive seats, fairly split there, 43 Democrats, 46 Republicans. There is a number of scenarios out there whereby the Republicans could make significant inroads and reduce that majority that the Democrats currently hold. But it is hard to see the Republicans being so successful this election that they would actually flip the House. In fact, very few pollsters or pundits, and even if you ask Republicans behind closed doors, believe that the Republicans are going to reclaim the House. So I think the question here is going to be either will the Democrats repeat the success of 2018, where they picked up a number of new seats in the House and they flipped a lot of traditional Republican seats, suburban seats, some rural seats, to Democrats. So will they continue that trend and maybe even expand their majority in the House? Or will the Republicans make a few inroads and reduce that that majority that the Democrats currently hold? At the end of the day, it's not going to make a tremendous amount of difference as long as the Democrats still hold power in the House. They're going to be in a position, obviously, to drive the legislative agenda. The Republicans will play more defense than offense. But I think that the battle for the House will be interesting in the sense that it will give the Republican Party a test. It will be a test for the Republican Party, rather, to see if some of their new messaging and their efforts to appeal to more moderate voters in some of those suburban districts that we talked about earlier, if that is going to work or not. And obviously, in the event that President Trump loses by a bigger margin than most people would suspect, I think that the second scenario there is that the House could really solidify as a Democratic chamber for some years to come. Next slide, please. So I want to touch briefly on split ticket voting. Split ticket voting, of course, is when a voter in an election votes for candidates from different political parties when multiple offices are being decided by a single election. Now, split ticket voting is on the decline in recent years, as you can see from the graph. And it is not entirely clear how this will impact the election. But if I had to guess, I would say that split ticket voting may be the reason why the Republicans retain control of the United States Senate. And I say this because I think it is relatively easy to see a scenario where, for example, voters in Maine and North Carolina cast their votes for Senators Susan Collins and Senator Tom Tillis, while also voting for Mr. Biden. We talked about the Senate a little earlier, and obviously both Maine and North Carolina are two states that are in play. But those two candidates, particularly Senator Susan Collins, are very experienced political operatives. Susan Collins in particular has a long track record in the United States Senate and has strong support in Maine. So it is possible there that the voters will go to the ballot and cast their votes for her while also voting for, let's say, Joe Biden. And same thing, as I mentioned, could happen in North Carolina and to a certain degree maybe in Colorado. And so we'll have to see the extent to which split ticket voting is going to make an impact, but I think it may, and I think it's something that you'll see a lot of pundits talking about here as we get closer to the election. So next slide, please. So just recapping, and we've talked about this already, these are the senators up for re-elections in states won by the opposing party's 2016 presidential candidate. And you can see there, Colorado and Maine, for example, those are states that President Trump won, but where the Democrats are currently favored. You could look at Alabama, a state that Doug Jones won, where President Trump and the Republicans are currently favored, as well as Michigan, of course, a state that President Trump won, but Gary Peters is favored to win. So those four states aside, much of the rest of the map is pretty traditional in terms of the states that are likely to re-elect Republicans, the states that are likely to re-elect Democrats. But as you can see, the Republicans obviously defending 23 seats this election, the Democrats only defending 12. Again, you got a couple of notables there with Doug Jones in a tough spot, Tom Udall, and we'll talk a little bit about him more, retiring, although that seat is not expected to switch. Gary Peters, who may or may not be in a little bit of trouble depending on which pollster you talk to, which poll you read. But then look at all those Republican seats. They've got a number of senators retiring: Pat Roberts, Lamar Alexander, Mike Enzi. None of those are really expected to flip. And then you've got some of the ones we've talked about: Tom Tillis, Susan Collins, Cory Gardner, Martha McSally. Interestingly enough, recently, though, we've heard some rumblings that people like Dan Sullivan, for example, from Alaska, may be in trouble, or Kelly Loeffler from Georgia. So going back to the discussion about not making predictions this close to the election, I'm going to stay away from making predictions about any of those seats. but stick with my view, at least, September 23rd, that I think it will come down to 1 or 2 seats here. I think that, Democrats will pick up 3, Republicans will pick up 1, and then it really will depend, I think, on how President Trump does. If he does well, the Republicans will probably, retain their seats in North Carolina and Maine, and probably won't lose any more. If President Trump does not do well, or worse than expected, then you might actually see seats beyond North Carolina and Maine flip to the Democrats. Next slide, please. So only 2 Democratic seats are in the top 10 most likely to flip party control. So this is just reinforcing some of what we just talked about. You see there Alabama, Colorado, Arizona, North Carolina, Maine, and some of the other seats, Georgia, Iowa. Kansas is that open seat, Pat Roberts retiring. There were some concerns among Republicans there that they would nominate a candidate that would not be electable in Kansas. They dodged a bullet there in the primary, so that seat is likely to stay with the Republicans. Next slide, please. 14 Democratic House seats are in the top 20 most likely to flip party control. Now, that obviously says or tells a slightly different story than what we talked about earlier, right? The Democrats are expected to retain control of the House. Many think that they will actually pick up seats. But if you look at those 20 seats most likely to flip, the Democrats are defending 14 out of those 20. So there is an opportunity here for Republicans to potentially pick up some seats. And I would look at seats like Kendra Horn's seat in Oklahoma, a fairly suburban seat. That was one of those that the Democrats flipped in 2018. I would look at Cindy Axne's seat in Iowa, again, one that the Democrats flipped. You got Don Bacon representing Omaha. That is always one of the most contested seats every single election, and it has gone back between a Democrat and a Republican for some time now. Max Rose, Long Island, has a pretty tough election. Again, a recent arrival to Congress as part of that recent wave, with the House Democrats solidifying their control of the lower chamber. He has a pretty tough race. Colin Peterson, Minnesota 7. Colin Peterson, the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee. Always a tough race. He's been in Congress for a long time, which speaks to his ability to get reelected as a Democrat in a fairly Republican district. But the fact that he has a tough race on his hands as the chair of a very important committee, especially so to his district, tells you that, when it comes to elections, you just can't take anything for granted. So these are the seats that I'm going to be looking at over the next couple of weeks. And I think these are the seats that you'll hear a lot about from commentators on TV, from pundits, and the news media in general. Next slide, please. So we've talked about a little bit about Joe Biden's chances. We've talked a little bit about President Trump's chances, or at least sort of the keys to the presidential election. We've talked about the House. We've talked about the Senate. So let's look at a few possible election scenarios. And while I've included 8 different scenarios here, pretty much every single scenario that I could think of, I'm going to focus on the 3 that I believe are the most likely. The scenario 1 is the status quo. In this scenario, Trump wins re-election, perhaps narrowly. Democrats maintain control of the House, and Republicans hold on to the Senate. So pretty much what we have today. I think this scenario is going to result in continued gridlock and partisanship, a few legislative wins, greater reliance on executive actions. We've already seen a lot of those by a clearly frustrated President Trump over the past 3 years, and a focus on regulatory actions. So the White House is going to continue to move its deregulation agenda forward. They're going to try to get some wins where they can through executive action. Who knows what the mood in Washington and on Capitol Hill is going to be after the election. And by the way, I should have said this much earlier. The election is not going to be over on November 4th. There is a scenario where it could be if Biden were to win a couple of key states, and it's clear that he has won, let's say, Pennsylvania or Florida. I think perhaps then we will see maybe a fairly rapid conclusion to the election. Same goes for President Trump, by the way. If he were to win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, hold on to Florida, maybe win North Carolina again. So if it's decisive enough for either side, it will be over. But most likely it won't be. And the election and the post-election rather drama will carry on for some weeks. And so, just when you go to bed on November 3rd or early November 4th, I would not advise you to think that we'll have the results just yet. But at any rate, scenario one is probably going to bring much of the same. And while we don't know what the mood will be, it's very likely that it's going to be full of recriminations and more partisanship. And so on the legislative side, it's tough to see any big legislative victories early next year or at all. The one potential thing that might move is infrastructure. Infrastructure is always seen as a bipartisan issue, but it was seen as a bipartisan issue, and the one issue that hopefully President Trump and the Democratic Congress could rally around 4 years ago, and that didn't happen. And of course, where we are today with the FAST Act, which is the legislative vehicle that authorizes funds for surface transportation programs, that's set to expire here in about 7 days on September 30th. Congress is likely to pass a 1-year extension, but that means that work on that bill and on infrastructure investment overall will carry into next year. And so that could be the one positive, perhaps, opportunity for a Trump administration and a Democratic Congress, certainly Democratic House, to come together and work on. But other than that, scenario one, I think, is going to be much of the same for another 4 years. Scenario five is probably the most likely scenario right now, at least statistically speaking. In this scenario, Biden wins, but the Republicans retain control of the Senate. Now, this scenario will see a big push for regulatory reform. So again, focus on regulations, but just a different focus. But not much in the way of legislative wins since the Republicans control the Senate. And again, the mood here in Washington, may shift this a little bit. That perhaps the Senate Republicans may use this as an opportunity to reset their relationship with the Democrats, and maybe they could come together on some legislative issues, again, like infrastructure, immigration reform, workforce development. But again, it's unlikely. Finally, scenario six sees sweeping Democratic wins across the board, although without a Democratic supermajority in the Senate. That means that the Democrats are not going to come even close to having 60 seats. This scenario will also see a big push for regulatory reform and perhaps some legislative wins on a few bipartisan issues like infrastructure investment, for example. This is probably for those of us who are eager to see Congress take bold bipartisan action on a long-term investment, sustainable investment in our nation's infrastructure. This is probably the one scenario that may deliver that, or at least has the biggest chance of delivering that. But again, no major legislative accomplishments. And this is, of course, because, we have a White House. We have two chambers in the U.S. In the Congress, rather, the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate, and they all need to work together in order to make real progress. And over the past 10 years or so, we have been on this gradual but steady slope towards more and more partisanship and gridlock. And so, regardless of what happens, it is hard to be optimistic. Although I am an optimist by default, that much will get done in terms of those big legislative wins that the country needs. But we'll see. And I'm making predictions yet again. I don't have a great track record of it. So let's just move on. Next slide, please. So. Next, let's turn to what a Biden administration might look like. One of the favorite parlor games in Washington at the moment, by the way. Now, what we have up here on the slide is based on what we are hearing from Biden's advisors and campaign insiders. And while the usual caveats apply, I'm confident that many of the individuals listed on this slide will play key roles in the Biden administration in one way or another. The Department of the Interior, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Commerce are obviously of particular interest to our industry. And the top contenders for these cabinet positions are very familiar to us. Senator Tom Udall, you mentioned him earlier, the senior senator from New Mexico, who is retiring, is a centrist Democrat with a track record of working across the aisle. Senator Amy Klobuchar, the senior senator from Minnesota and recent candidate for president herself, is another moderate Democrat with a record of supporting rural America, and actually enjoys quite a bit of support from a lot of growers, farmers, ranchers, commodity groups, etc. So she's got good relationships there. And then there's Tom Nides, who's currently managing director and vice chairman of Morgan Stanley. Mr. Nides is a professed free trader who served as chief of staff to former U.S. Trade Representative Mickey Cantor under President Bill Clinton. That's when NAFTA was negotiated and signed. If you look at these three, right, these are just three cabinet positions. Obviously, there's a lot more, and you'll see a few other contenders up there for a few other positions as well. But these are three important positions in a Biden cabinet, and it's interesting that if these predictions are true, and obviously in the event of a Biden administration, that he is looking at more what I would describe establishment, traditional Democrats. This is not a cabinet made up of the more progressive wing of the party, and I think that bodes well certainly for our industry. Again, who knows what policies these three, if indeed they are part of the cabinet, would advance. But just looking at the track record, it reinforces this idea. The Biden campaign has been spending a lot of time advancing, certainly with the business community, that he's looking to appoint people who are have deep experience governing, who are seen as more centrist, who certainly have relationships to the business community. Not looking to put in a lot of new progressive members of the Democratic Party. Next slide, please. So what happens, we talked a little bit earlier here on the scenarios, right? Scenario 5, if there is unified government, if the Democrats retain control of the House, regain control of the Senate, and if Joe Biden is successful and becomes president of the United States. Well, policy changes through executive order on day one. We've heard a lot about executive orders over the past 3.5 years, and really over the past 11.5 years, because President Obama made use of executive orders quite frequently as well. And so I would expect that one of the first things that President Biden would do is to reverse a lot of the Trump era executive through his own executive actions, so rescind and replace them. Something that he could do early on day one without much input from Congress. Obviously, we talked a little bit about the potential people that may serve in a Biden administration, and we talked about those establishment Democrats. I would expect quite a few former Obama officials as well. Maybe not at the senior levels, maybe not at the cabinet level, but certainly throughout a Biden administration, you'd have a lot of Obama folks returning to Washington to serve in the Biden administration. What does that mean? Well, one could argue on the one hand that that means that you're going to have people with experience in government, and probably with not a lot of they're not going to need a lot of time to get themselves situated and going, because they have experience already. Compare that, for example, to President Trump, who has staffed many of his agencies and his administration with people with very, very little or no government experience. So that's one potential outcome. Obviously, the flip side is you're going to have a lot of people coming in with the Obama administration background and some set views, perhaps a certain outlook on policy, and so I think you'll have that push pull there. On the one hand, you'll have some people with experience, which is always good. At least some experience is always good. But then you may have quite a few folks from the previous administration, previous Democratic administration, which may color some of their policies a bit. So I would watch for that. There will be budget reconciliation for climate, health, and tax policy changes. Budget reconciliation is a maneuver, a legislative maneuver to try to expedite passage of large legislative packages. You will recall that budget reconciliation was used, for example, to pass the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, and it has been used with some success by both Democrats and Republicans. It was used for tax reform a few years ago. So it is a way to circumvent the standard procedures of the House and the Senate, and to try to get large legislative packages passed while you may not have the support that you normally need to get those through regular order. So there'll be a fair amount of maneuvering on the part of the Biden administration to get some of those large legislative priorities through. Climate change in particular is going to be a big priority for the Biden administration. There's already been talk about potentially creating a cabinet level position specifically around climate change. Tax policy, we know that Mr. Biden plans to raise the corporate tax rate. And in fact, he told us so at an event that we held earlier this year, before COVID-19, believe it or not, that there actually was such a thing. We hosted, as an association, a series of debates in Las Vegas with 4 presidential candidates at that time. Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar were among them, specifically around infrastructure. And Joe Biden, after the event, told me that he very much plans to raise the corporate tax rate by somewhere between 6 and 8 percentage points. And part of that will be used to pay for infrastructure. So while that's certainly good news for us in the sense that we do need to fund our infrastructure, the fact that the corporate tax rate, that at least try to raise the corporate tax rate, we've got some concerns about that. So that's going to be another big heavy lift initially for a Biden administration. But on the more positive side, I do actually believe that they will start with infrastructure. Some of these other issues are going to be a lot more difficult to get through. I think the Biden administration learned a lesson from the Trump administration, who thought about starting with infrastructure and then decided to not go there and instead try to repeal Obamacare, which I know to this day they regret not starting with infrastructure. I think the same holds for President Trump. Should he win re-election, I think infrastructure will be his big priority, if not just for the first 100 days, but certainly for the first full year. And so I would watch for that being a top issue for either candidate, actually. Now, who's going to drive congressional policy action? Is it going to be Majority Leader Schumer, or is it going to be Speaker Pelosi? Majority Leader, assuming that the Democrats retain control of the Senate, otherwise Minority Leader Schumer, or is it going to be the committees? This has been an issue that has been hotly discussed, debated, fretted about in Washington for many years now. The fact that we've seen increasing consolidation of power among congressional leadership, both Republicans and Democrats, at the expense of committee chairs. The days when committee chairs were powerful power brokers in Washington and really drove the legislative agenda are largely gone. There's an effort underway to try to regain some of that, and we shall see what happens. Next slide, please. Biden policy initiatives, we've talked a little bit about those: climate change, environmental regulations, trade, transportation, and infrastructure. Again, comprehensive infrastructure legislation is something that the Biden team is actively working on, and they're working collaboratively actually with a number of think tanks and industry groups across Washington, and so we've been talking to them about that. Trade, I think that there's both good news and bad news here for our industry. I think the Biden administration will try to reduce trade uncertainty, or some of the trade uncertainty that we've seen over the past 3.5 years, and focus more on cooperation with our traditional trading partners. So what does that mean? Probably not as frequent use of tariffs as a threat during negotiations with for free trade agreements, or just in the general sort of interactions with our trading partners. That is certainly good news for our industry. Some of those tariffs, as many of you know, have had a very negative impact on our member companies and on equipment manufacturing overall. Getting tough on China. I think this is maybe one of those rare moments where both President Trump and Mr. Biden are on the same page. Both have expressed desire, stated objective to continue to be tough on China. I think the difference here perhaps is that President Biden would work more with our allies and trading partners, would maybe try to resuscitate something like the TPP to bring some of those allies closer to us. The thinking there is that it's hard for the U.S. alone to effect any change on behalf of the Chinese, but along with Japan, Australia, the European Union, etc., will be more effective. So I think that's another differentiating factor perhaps between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. Obviously, climate change, environmental regulations, competition policy, labor reforms are going to be top priorities for the Biden administration. And here I think the thing to watch is that the Democratic Party in many ways is a little different from the Republican Party in that they have many different wings within the party. You've got the progressive wing, you've got the environmental wing, you've got the social justice wing, you've got the pro-business wing, and they all have their leaders, and you see many of them on television, right? They're members of Congress or members of the House and the Senate, or just political operatives, right? They're very vocal about the group within the party that they represent. And so the question is, how much do they believe that a President Biden owes them for getting elected, and how much does President Biden believe that he owes them? So I think that will be the push-pull to watch for. Which wing within the Democratic Party will be seen as more powerful, or which wings more powerful, which wings less so. And I think that's going to largely dictate which policy priorities rise to the surface fastest. But again, infrastructure, watch for that to be one of the ones that are likely to get a lot of attention early on. Next slide, please. So a Trump second.
And Kip, just a little interrupters a little bit. We probably have another maybe 5 to 10 minutes here, so just wanted to be cognizant of the time.
Thank you, Dave. That's very polite of you. I will try to speed it up here, and we're almost at the end, so okay. I appreciate that. So the Trump second term agenda, finance and economy. Obviously, a lot of these issues that you see on the screen here are issues that have been bread and butter issues for the Trump administration. Jobs. The president is very proud of the manufacturing jobs and the jobs as a whole that he claims to have created. He has a promise to create 10 million more manufacturing jobs in the first 10 months, to continue to chip away at the tax code to make it more competitive for businesses, and to continue to chip away at some of the regulations that he and his administration see as being detrimental to businesses' ability to compete globally. So those are expected to be top priorities. Crackdown on China. Obviously, President Trump's efforts to get a deal out of China is something that we've all watched for the past 3.5 years almost, right? And currently we are sort of in between a phase 1 and a phase 2. I know the president is eager to get a long-term deal with the Chinese done as soon as possible. It is the one issue that he keeps coming back to when he talks about policy, and so I think that's going to be a key priority as well. In a second term, there'll be an added effort on focus on small businesses, how to support small businesses, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic or being still in the middle of it, depending on how that plays out. And then banking, they are trying to chip away at the Dodd-Frank Act, the CFPB. They want to see some reforms there. So I think that the tax and finance is going to be a big part of a second term Trump agenda. Next slide, please. So again, there are some of the key priorities that we touched on. Again, continue to go after Obama era rules of the Dodd-Frank, under the Dodd-Frank Act. That's on the finance side of the equation. Continue to strengthen the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was the big tax reform bill that was passed and signed into law in 2017. So compared to a Biden administration where their intent is to raise the corporate tax rate, Trump administration is going to try to lower that, but also affect change on some smaller pieces of tax reform and some of the things that they didn't get done. So for example, the death tax is something that the Trump administration has talked a lot about trying to abolish that. I don't see that as happening, but at least maybe chipping away at that and making some changes. Made in America tax credits is a big part of their list of priorities for next year. It is pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. Any company that reshores, brings back manufacturing, creates more manufacturing in America a certain, obviously, percentage of content being made here in America. It's not going to be 100%, but it's going to be higher than it probably is under the USMCA. Companies would get tax credits, so it's a way of incentivizing manufacturing in the U.S. and to bring manufacturing jobs back. Reduce occupational licensing laws, encourage public-private partnerships. Some of the other priorities that we keep hearing from the Trump administration that they're going to focus on in a second term. Next slide, please. Just a few more here. Expanding opportunity zones is one that's really interesting. Many of our member companies have taken advantage of this. This is actually something that Senator Scott from South Carolina has championed. It's a way of helping to revitalize areas, particularly in suburbia or even in urban centers, to bring opportunity to those areas in terms of investment, jobs. Several of our member companies have actually reestablished or established new operations in opportunity zones. So it's a good program, and because it's a good program, because it had a lot of success, even some bipartisan support, I see a great focus on that. Bringing back manufacturing jobs from China, that goes back to those tax credits and the Trump administration's focus on creating more manufacturing jobs. Allowing minimum wage to be controlled at the state and local levels. That would be a tough battle, particularly the way that the election, I think, is going to solidify more control for Democrats, over governorships and the state and local. But it's something that the Trump administration cares deeply about. And then enact some tax cuts to boost take-home pay for working-class Americans. Another key priority to watch for in a second term. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. I hope it's been helpful. I'd like to return to the very beginning, where Dave reminded me very politely that I owe him a case of beer for making predictions 4 years ago. So take this with the usual caveats. But I think if you've taken anything away from this, hopefully it is that this election is going to be critically important, not just for the country, but for our industry, because so much is at stake. You have two candidates for president, President Trump and Mr. Biden, who have very different views for the country. And they have very different stated plans for how to achieve those views. And so, elections always have consequences. I think this year it may be more so than ever. Obviously, when it comes to the Congress, much is at stake there as well. If President Biden wins, but the Republicans retain control of the Senate, it's a very different scenario. And President Biden then would be challenged to try to get some of his marquee legislative initiatives through. Now, if it's a landslide and the Democrats regain control of the Senate, while they won't have a supermajority and won't be able to just force legislative proposals through, that's going to make a big difference, and they will feel emboldened. They'll feel like they have a national mandate to go forth and try to enact their vision for the country, and so. The point here is that no matter what happens, it's going to be consequential, and it's going to have an impact on the country and on our industry. And so while I hope I've covered enough to give you a sense of the state of the race and maybe a bit of an inside look on the Biden administration potentially and what the Trump administration part 2 would bring, I know I haven't touched on nearly everything. And so I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have about the state of the race, about policy, whether it's infrastructure, tax reform, trade. We can talk politics, we can talk policy.
Thanks for those insights into the general election. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to kind of get right into one question. And that's probably the one everyone wants to know right now, which is what's going on with the Supreme Court? What's your prediction?
Well, that's a great question, Dave, and it is the one issue right now that everyone is talking about in Washington D.C. President Trump came out today and said that he wants to make sure that the court is fully functioning, meaning that it has 9 justices in case they need to decide the election. So that is the recent sort of posturing from the White House. And now, obviously, it's a fair argument to a certain extent that obviously we do want a Supreme Court with 9 justices on it, as is intended. But I think it just shows you the intensity with which this debate and this confirmation is taking over everything in Washington. The government is about to run out of money on September 30th. The House and the Senate are struggling to get a continuing resolution passed so that they can fund themselves and fund the country. There's a lot of large legislative priorities left this year: an infrastructure bill, an energy bill, an education reform bill. None of that is going to get done until this Supreme Court fight is over with. So my prediction, Dave, is that it's going to be pretty nasty, unfortunately, and even more partisan than it already is. And in terms of who's going to actually be our 9th justice, I gave up making predictions, and as I told you earlier, I already owe you a case of beer, so I don't want to make any more predictions.
Well, I guarantee you 100% it's going to be nasty because the stakes are high. If President Trump is able to get a Supreme Court justice across the line and there's a Biden presidency, do you think there's any ramifications for Trump pushing that through, or the Republicans pushing that through?
I think unfortunately right now the everything is viewed through the political lens and through the campaign lens. And I think, look, Lindsey Graham, who obviously is a influential senator in that he has a good relationship with the president. He's the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He has said that there will be hearings in mid-October and that there will be a vote before the election. Democratic senators that I've talked to today are fully prepared for a vote before the election. I think in some ways everyone would rather do the vote before the election. Because at least it's sort of partisanship as usual. If it happens after the election, and I think regardless of who wins the White House, it would just complicate things further and make it even more partisan. So I think that's maybe the one thing that everyone agrees on, that to the extent that this should happen now and not until we have our next president, it ought to happen before the election.
Great. Let me get to a question here from the audience. Under a Biden presidency, what do you think their policy will be towards oil and gas market? In this case, the exploration, use of polyethylene pipe, all that stuff.
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously of great importance to your company, Dave, and obviously to our industry as well. Vice President, or candidate, I should say now, Biden has been fairly unequivocal in his support for the current energy policy, which is making sure that we tap into all of our energy resources, be it wind, be it solar, but also natural gas, oil, and fracking. And he actually came out about a month ago in doing a visit to Pennsylvania and said, I support fracking. And so I think I actually think that whether it is a Biden or a Trump administration, but since the question is about the Biden administration, I actually don't see any short-term changes to our domestic energy policy. I think there's wide support. I know there's wide support on the Hill, both among Democrats and Republicans, to make sure that we're not dependent on foreign oil. There's been a lot of work done over the past decade to pass legislation and enact policies that would sort of help disassociate ourselves a little bit from that. And so while there will be pressure on Biden, no doubt, from the sort of progressive left wing of the Democratic Party to maybe clamp down a little bit on fracking and oil exploration, I suspect he will hold the line. And I also think that, depending on who he appoints as his Secretary of the Interior, that's going to tell you a lot. But right now, the current candidate, or one of the current candidates, is a fairly pro all the energy forms in our portfolio type of guy. So I'm cautiously optimistic that it's not going to be widespread change.
Great. Here's another one from the audience. Under either presidency, any hopes for getting more funds to fix our water infrastructure?
Yes, I think the answer to that is absolutely yes, and for a couple of reasons. As you'll recall, there was a lot of speculation and hope that President Trump would start off his first term in office by getting a big infrastructure bill passed. They went with sort of trying to repeal and reform the ACA, otherwise known as Obamacare, and there's still a lot of regrets in the White House for not going with infrastructure. Biden has said that he's going to be laser focused on infrastructure and during his first 100 days and certainly his first year in office. And there's widespread support currently in Congress to actually start doing something. The good news for us is that it looks like, if the continuing resolution does pass, and I do believe it will, even though it'll probably come down to the wire. There is a 1-year reauthorization of the FAST Act included in that. The FAST Act obviously is the bill, the current legislation that pays for all of our surface transportation infrastructure. But they've already started attaching a few specific funding mechanisms for water infrastructure to the CR. And once we get going on a larger infrastructure package, water will most definitely be part of that. So I think we're going to see a lot of infrastructure legislation coming out of Congress next year, regardless of who controls the White House, and water will be part of it.
That's great. And this is kind of a follow-up question or similar to that. It says, seems like roads and bridges get a lot of attention. How do we get them to focus on the infrastructure they can't see, i.e. the water, the gas, the sewer, the buried infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And at AEM, our position on infrastructure is that it is not just roads and bridges. It is the broad infrastructure portfolio of our country, right? Locks and dams, waterways, rural broadband. Obviously, the underground piece is a huge part of that. Airports, rail, and so we've been hammering Congress that setting aside this 1-year extension, which we need because we don't want the funding for the Highway Trust Fund to run out on September 30th, and it buys Congress some time to actually get a larger infrastructure bill passed. Once they start working on that, and Chairman DeFazio of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, as well as Chairman Barrasso, who chairs the Senate EPW Committee, the two committees of jurisdiction, both agree that the infrastructure bill, when it happens, hopefully next year, will include not just roads and bridges. There's widespread support for that, including the infrastructure. I like that phrasing that we can't see. So that's very much part of it. And so, for those of you who are sort of looking ahead, I am very optimistic, more so than I've been in a long time, that infrastructure will be a priority, and it will not just be roads and bridges, but the underground piece as well.
Okay, so here's another one from the audience. I've always heard that our legislators want to hear from, quote, us, but how does someone go about that? Do you letter, email? What do you think is the most efficient way to get a hold of your legislator?
Well, that is a great question. I have not gotten that question in a long while. Usually people say, how do I not pay attention to politics because the system is broken? So, that's great. There are lots of ways that you can get involved. I mean, first and foremost, I would reach out to, and you can find all this information right on your member of Congress's website, whether it's a House or Senate member. Reach out to their district office. And some of them will have multiple district offices. Reach out to the one closest to you, talk to the district staff, find out next time the congressman or congresswoman is back home for district work week, and make an appointment. It's not always easy, but you'd be surprised. They spend an awful lot of time back home these days, and the campaign is about to really, enter its final month where they will be home the entire time. And they do keep office hours. It sounds maybe silly, but they do. So that's one way. They do town halls all the time. Not all of them, and there's been a lot of controversy about that recently, right? Some refuse to do town halls because they get sort of nasty, but most of them still do town halls and ask the district office, hey, when's the next town hall? Show up, ask a question. Obviously, you can send them an email, and there's ways of doing that on their website. I've got to be honest with you, you're going to get a response written by a staffer, but attributed to the congressman. That's not because they don't care. It's 'cause they get thousands of emails and letters every day, right? You can make the case that they should respond to each and every one of them, but then they wouldn't really be doing anything but that. If you come to Washington, drop in and see your member of Congress. They actually make more time for constituents than they do for anyone else, including us, whose job it is to go and talk to them every day. So there's lots of ways of doing it. And if you want some help, feel free to reach out to me. I'm sure Dave can pass along my contact information. We can help as well.
I'd be glad to. Okay, so here's, I think, one last one. It says, Kip, you skipped the discussion of the filibuster during a Biden win scenario. Could you please cover that topic?
So there's been a lot of discussion, right, about what to do with the filibuster, and I assume this is what the question is getting towards. You know, is the Senate going to continue to sort of reform the way it does business? Is it going to skip the filibuster, you know, entirely? Obviously, there's been a lot of attention focused on the rules of the Senate. And the fact that, you know, over the past 10, 20 years, really, you know, some of those rules have been changed by both parties. And when it comes to Supreme Court nominations and the process for that really started with Justice Bork back in the day, and then, you know, I think each party has sort of been guilty of trying to bend the rules to their favor. And so it remains to be seen. And I think it's not so much about a Biden administration or a Biden presidency as it is about the makeup of the Senate. Because there are still, believe it or not, senators, Democrats and Republicans, who are very much institutionalists. They believe in the institution of the United States Senate. They believe that they are an important check on the House and on the White House, the administration. And that, you know, are vehemently opposed to reducing or withering away at those rules. So I think, you know, if Chuck Schumer is the majority leader, if the Democrats take over control of the Senate, there might be an attempt to try to change the filibuster. If Majority Leader McConnell is the majority leader, if the Republicans retain control of the Senate. And you know, I think they might. I don't see the filibuster going anywhere. But even so, Chuck Schumer is a fairly conservative, small c conservative, when it comes to the role of the Senate, unlike, let's say, you know, some of his colleagues. So I think the filibuster is safe. I really do, at least for the next few years. And we might actually see even a return to some of the old rules that have been chipped away at, again, depending on who controls the Senate.
Okay. Well, it is going to be an exciting time. And there's going to be a lot of hurt feelings one way or the other when this thing is all said and done. And I hope that somehow we can come back together as a country like we did after 9/11 and move on. And maybe some of this bipartisan stuff will calm down. We appreciate you in Washington fighting the good fight for infrastructure every day. And keep up the good work. And thanks again for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks.